This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
There's a level of pride that comes from putting food on the table that doesn't come from a restaurant or a grocery store. Wild game, catching fish, raising a garden, an apple orchard, winemaking, and the hobby of beekeeping for that delicious golden honey. Our guests are experts and provide some solid information if this is a pastime that you've considered for yourself. We go inside outdoors to see what all the buzz is about. Next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
It's time to register for Kentucky's elk hunts. This is Tim Farmer. The Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central and the only place to enter this year's draw. Elk hunting in Old Kentucky. Take it from me, there's nothing like it. 1,000 names will be drawn, and with the Pick 2 option, you gotta like your odds. The deadline is midnight, April 30th. The Kentucky Elk Draw. Enter at fw.ky.gov. Again, fw.ky.gov.
At the absolute worst, it was a little white lie.
A little white lie.
After all, when it hit the line, it felt like a 15-pounder. It doesn't matter what the scale says. So it might be an ever so slight deviation from the truth.
Sometimes in fishing, the truth is hard to catch.
Maybe just a stretch.
But the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, fishing isn't about math. It's about fun.
And fudging a little if you need to.
Kentucky Fishing.
It'll make a liar out of you.
This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and Kentucky Afield Radio is about wildlife and nature and how people interact with it. That might be hunting, might be fishing, bird watching, photography, beekeeping. An interesting way to interact with nature is beekeeping. And I was doing some research on the subject before we sat down to the microphones, and I've got to tell you, there is no way we're going to be able to cover everything about beekeeping in an hour. Organizations are formed around bees. Classes are taught about bees. Careers are made. We'll never cover it all, but we'll try at least to cover some of the highlights as they apply to what I'll call the backyard beekeeper. Bees have been a part of our life and our language for a long time. Honey Nut Cheerios features a bee, and we love that bee. We can take a look at the birds and the bees, being busy as a bee. Ali would always say, floats like a butterfly, stings like a bee. So we address bees with a certain amount of respect. Now, one of the reasons that bees are appreciated is probably for one of the most popular breakfast products ever put upon the earth, honey. Coleman Gilbert is my guest today on Kentucky Afield Radio, and he knows a thing or two about the honey business. You are a beekeeper, right, Coleman?
That's right.
It seems like it's not a hobby that attracts a lot of people, but it has attracted you. Can you tell me why?
Well, I have a great interest in plants. My backyard is full of plants. I noticed about 5 years ago that I didn't see very many honeybees, not like when I was a child. So I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to do to get bees back visible. So I checked into it, did a lot of reading, and found out that was something that I thought I would like to do. And so I invested in it, and I now have 6 hives and enjoy it immensely.
I guess one risk you have to accept is that you might get stung. Have you been stung?
Yes.
Is that something you can count on every day, or is it rare?
Well, it's rare for me because I do wear a veil and gloves for protection. A lot of beekeepers don't. But on the other hand, too, the sting it's more of scare than it is harmful or hurtful.
Beekeeping, I did a little research before you came in. 900 BC. Have you heard that date given before, that people have been so in love and so enamored with bees and the products they produce, or the product, honey, that it goes back before Christ by nearly 1,000 years. Have you heard that?
Well, what I have heard is that honey has been discovered in tombs or whatever in Egypt, and the honey brought out, and the honey was still edible.
Really?
Really.
Really? That's neat. I should point out why I've asked Mr. Gilbert here. You are not an entomologist.
No.
You are not necessarily an expert other than what the expertise your years of experience have given you. You are here because you enjoy it. You are a backyard gardener. This is something you picked up on your own, were drawn to it. You have sought out advice on how to do it. You've joined a beekeeper club, and it's something that you do for fun. I want to talk to Coleman Gilbert today about, well, what do you have to do to get into it? Is it expensive? How much space do you have to have? Beekeeping for you, it's a pastime. When we speak, generally the subject of bees is going to get up. Have you been able to interest friends in this hobby?
Certain friends I have, and they generally start out with 1 hive, 2 hives, and then as they get into it, their hives increase and their interest increases. They become members of the bee club. They talk to other people about the hobby, how interesting it is, and ultimately the end product of it being honey. They eventually get into selling it, giving it away, or increasing their hives so they can increase their honey production.
Okay. Grafenberg, Kentucky.
It's far eastern Shelby County.
Far eastern Shelby County. So not necessarily a metropolis. You have the space to do it by living near Grafenberg, Kentucky. In fact, the label on your honey bottle says Grafenberg Gold, and so you've named it after the area you live. So you have the space to do this. How much space do you need? I'm wondering, and there may be an ordinance that addresses this, it's not something an apartment dweller could certainly do, and I'm wondering if somebody who lives in a neighborhood may want to do. That may raise an eyebrow, or what do you know? Do you know people that live in various places that do this, where space really isn't an issue?
I know people that live in apartments. If the roof allows, they can put a beehive there, and if the ordinances allow, they can put a beehive there. I know people that have 3 or 4 hives on the tops of buildings in Louisville. Like I get a large amount of honey production out of it, and a beehive can go anywhere just about. If you've got just a limited amount of space and the ordinances allow it, the hive is roughly 1 foot by 1 foot. It's a square. You've got enough room to get around that to work the hive and space for the bees to get out and forage, and that's basically what you need as far as space.
We want to go to a phone call right now, Coleman. We have Fritz Voracek, who is not just a wildlife biologist and also a fellow beekeeper. Mr. Voracek, when I think honey production, I think food. Hence, the Department of Agriculture, if not the USDA, might want to weigh in on all this. But for personal, private use, how do bees and the law tie together?
Now, this is a super gray area. I'd actually contact the local state and the agriculture representatives. From what I understand, in some counties, they're not considered agriculture, while in other counties, and even townships, they are. Most of your agricultural situations for townships don't want cows, pigs, chickens in downtown, so they call it basically all of agriculture. For the state specifically, they call bees agriculture.
And that's true. I can see that. But, you know, with a bee, there are going to be bees in towns anyway. If there's a flower, I guarantee you there's going to be a bee there. That's just the way nature works.
Here in Frankfurt, however, they do acknowledge a honeybee as an agricultural product, and will allow them in the township. More than likely, you want them out in the fields, though, and not so much heavily in the towns. But it doesn't hurt to have them in towns.
That's one city. There's 120 counties across the state. It's kind of hard to know where would a person go in their own town or county to call and ask.
I would imagine the city commissioners would be your best bet. And I've gone through like Sean Burgess, our state apiary inspector. He's going to address that, I imagine, here pretty soon because he's come across just that situation.
Our guest Coleman Gilbert at the very opening of the show said when we were talking about space requirements to do this, that apartment dwellers can often be allowed to put hives on the roof. And you've done that, and you have done that in some of the largest cities across the nation, in places where you wouldn't dream there would be a beehive.
Absolutely. Originally, my background's from New England, so I got to bring them into downtown Boston. That worked out pretty nice because I lived on the pier, had them way out in like abandoned wharfs, and they worked out really well, actually. I also moved around because my dad races horses, so I was out at Sportsman's Park, and I kept a couple bees over there. And then I've also kept them in New York City with a couple other friends, the various extents of my trips, I guess. And, they do okay in cities. But I wouldn't necessarily want to utilize them specifically just for that, especially in a commercial operation. There's just not enough forage to have a large enough density of bees to make it a feasible situation.
The subject today is the fascinating hobby of beekeeping. Talking today with beekeeper Coleman Gilbert and also wildlife biologist Fritz Voracek. And Fritz, I'm going to ask you to hang around to chat just a little bit more into our next segment. Our show will continue. I'm Charlie Baglin, and this is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. An interesting topic today, beekeeping. Chances are you don't do it, but chances are you love the honey that beehives produce. You love the flowers on which bees collect this pollen. You like the wildlife that lives within these native plants. Everything sort of ties and fits in together. Talking with two fellas today, Coleman Gilbert, who is a hobbyist, and Fritz Voracek, who is on the phone from his office in Frankfurt. You, Coleman, you've gone to special efforts to put native plants on your property. If I'm standing on your back step, what is it I'm going to see when I look around your property?
Standing on the back step, you'll see 3.5 acres of wooded area. There are native plants that I have brought in. There are native plants that were there. You've got sumac, you've got goldenrod, got Joe Pye weed, all kinds of asters.
You're out in the country.
Right.
Now, Fritz, you're a city dweller. If I'm on your back porch and I look around, what am I going to see there?
Only if you're standing directly in my yard will you actually know if they're there. I've got a privacy fence and a large hedge around everything. I'm kind of at the top of a hill, and so I'll channel and force the bees to go up and over my structure. I only keep like a couple here downtown, usually the ones that I'm actually working on, getting healthy. If I just remove a swarm, I'll keep them here for a couple days, get them strong, and then move them out to the country where I can actually go to money for me.
So there are differences. Yet, if you're out in the country or you raise them in town, there has to be a place, there has to be flowering plants in existence for these bees to go to and come back to make their honey.
Yes.
Coleman lives in the countryside, Fritz lives in the city. Is that honey going to taste the same?
That's actually a very good question. And yes, it definitely would. Most of the bees that I keep downtown, again, are only actually for like swarm removals that I just removed. So I do no honey production at my house in downtown residential areas. I definitely have astounding yards over by Schweitzer, Waddy, Georgetown, and up Bald Knob. That's where about 50 beehives are scattered all throughout there.
Is this something you could easily recommend to somebody, either one of you, to get involved? Because this is an interaction with nature that not a lot of people do.
You'd be surprised. We have 420-plus people, I think, coming every year to the Kentucky Bee School. So something's happening. A lot more people are getting tuned in.
It does sound like it's growing in popularity. Fritz Voracek, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The public perception of a bee is that they swarm and they come after you, and not the case necessarily if you do it right. And there are some misconceptions out there, Coleman. I bet you, because you have worked with these, you kind of know the truth from the myth. Let me ask you, a swarm of bees sounds frightening, but what is a swarm?
Well, a swarm of bees is actually when the queen, or about half of the bees in the hive, take off for a new location. It's usually their way of procreating or keeping the species going. They take half the hive, the old queen, and then they leave a queen either about to be born to rule the hive that they're leaving.
They've gone to look for a new place to live.
Right.
And they're not protecting the old place.
Right.
So they're not in defense mode, or they're not in attack mode.
When bees are in a swarm, they're usually the less threatening that they will be. They don't have honey to protect, they don't have a home to protect, so they're the most docile that they're going to be.
So society has had that wrong all these years. In swarm mode, they are the less threatening and the most docile that they will ever be.
Right.
Alfred Hitchcock had a movie back forever ago called The Birds. And that's what is coming to mind, that a flock of birds or a swarm of bees is coming down, and they're going to win the fight. But in a swarm, that is when they are not in attack mode.
Right.
So I like having learned that. you made a comment about collecting the bees. That's interesting. It seems like a bee. If I were a bee, I'd want to just go out and just fly around and go where I want to go. How do I know when to come home? What is your role in letting me loose and getting me back home again?
Bees, I think, are the definition of free range because they go where they want to go. They can go up to about a 3-mile radius collecting the honey, but how they get back home when they're born, in the initial week or so, they fly out and orient themselves with the sun and the hive, and so they know their hive when they go out on the collecting the honey.
So they know where home is.
They know where home is. They know what home looks like. They sometimes drift from one hive to the other if the wind or other factors, but generally, if they do drift to another hive and they've got honey or they've got pollen, the hive that they're going into will allow them to come in and deposit that honey and that pollen.
So they know each other, I'm presuming.
No, if that bee did not have honey or pollen, they would challenge at the entrance, and that bee would probably not get in.
So it's a social structure, a password you sort of need. You need to show I'm a good guy bee and I have what it takes to come into this hive.
If it's not your original hive, then you've got to have pollen or honey to get into that hive. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll let you stay, but they'll take what you've got.
Bees have personalities.
Well, they have a temperament.
Describe bee temperament to me.
For example, I have 5 hives. I can work all 5 hives, get into all 5 hives in one day. One hive may be just as gentle as they can be. The other may just be as cranky as they can be. And they may sit right next to each other.
A cranky bee versus a nice bee. What's a bee do that you know that bee is cranky?
Usually it's not just any one bee. It may be a series of bees. If you get in and they're in that cranky mood, they'll start flying at you immediately, start going for the hands immediately. A docile hive, you can get in and work it and pick the frames up, and they won't have a problem with it.
About how many bees are in a hive?
It can vary based on the time of year, but usually in the middle of the summer or the end of the summer, you've got about 60,000 bees. That's a bunch of bees.
And they all need to eat. So how often do they need to go out and eat?
Well, actually, they don't. They eat in the hive. They eat the honey in the hive. What they're storing for us to take, as well as what they're storing for themselves to eat.
So the honey that they create from the pollen that they pick up is similar to what a squirrel is doing by collecting nuts for the winter.
Yeah, but you've got 2 different products there. You've got a pollen and you've got honey, and honey comes from the nectar. Pollen they store to feed their new bees. And they make what is called bee bread, and they feed that to their new babies or the bees in making. The honey they store to eat themselves. They cap it and store it for the wintertime to eat themselves. Excess that they make is what we take and bottle.
At what point do you risk not giving them enough to eat through the winter that you take the excess? What is that line of demarcation? You know what to take and you know what to leave.
Generally, you look at what they've got stored in the lower portions of the hive. The boxes that you put on for your use are called supers. You look at what they've got stored in the main hive body, and then if they've got sufficient stores there, and then they've also got stores in the supers, then the supers what you take.
Supers, stores, frames. Beekeeping has its own language, and you have to learn this. Where did you go, Coleman, for Beekeeping 101 when you first wanted to get started?
My initial education was at the library, checking out books on beekeeping, but also on the state of Kentucky has a state apiarist in the Department of Agriculture, which is a good resource to turn to, too.
I'm wondering if I want to get into this, if I want to pick up the game of golf or fishing, I know what the equipment is going to cost me. Is it expensive to get into beekeeping, to interact with nature in that way?
Well, you can get a hive set up for about $150. All of the equipment that you'll need to house your bees. A package of bees probably now would be about $75.
So we're talking $250 or so dollars. A spot to keep them. I presume you don't need, or do you need to keep them indoors in a shed or a barn, or is this out in the open?
Out in the open, there are certain requirements for placement of the hive. Plus, you also need to look at what your forage area is around you. If you've got no area of blooming trees, no areas of wildflowers, then that's usually indicating a bad place for a hive to be.
You could turn these bees loose, and they would live on their own.
Right.
But my bet is they'd keep coming back to the Grafenberg Gold headquarters because that's where home has been.
A lot of times when they do swarm, you don't get to get them back and put them in a new hive. They will take off and go somewhere else, and usually that's either an empty house, tree with holes in it, anywhere that they can make a decent home, they will go to.
Somebody told me once upon a time, if you don't understand, raise your hand and ask questions. And that is what I am doing today, and I'm learning. My name is Charlie Baglin. This is Kentucky Afield Radio, and we're talking about beekeeping. Coleman Gilbert is a hobbyist, and I'm asking him what he gets out of it, and the questions someone may want answers to who wants to get into it. Bees are one of nature's creatures that have the job of pollination, something we all learned about in grade school. If it stuck or not, I don't know. That's the transfer of pollen between flowers or flower parts that lead to fertilization and successful seed and fruit production for plants. We're up against a break. We have our fishing report standing by. When we come back and get into the subject a little more, Casey Schrader, biologist with the USDA, is going to join us to talk about the decline of honeybees and how the habitat that pollinators like is also home to rabbits, quail, and other wildlife. It is a honey of a show. Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Baglin. Our gentlemen fisheries biologists are standing by with What's Biting Where. But first, let me tell you this. There is nothing wrong with getting out of the house, especially if you're leaving the house with your fishing license in your pocket. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife has a Spring Madness contest you should know about, and you should enter. It's on Facebook. The prize is a 2-night stay at Lake Cumberland State Resort Park, a guided fishing trip for 2 people, 2 brand-new rod and reel combos. What I like about this is it's good for a year whenever you want to arrange it with the guide. All you need to do is like the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife on Facebook. Then look for the Spring Madness information. Entry is very, very quick, and it's brought to you by Realtree Extra Green and Kentucky State Parks. Great for anybody that needs a couple of days away. Women, that includes you too. Drawing will be in early May. More on bees, bee habitat, and the growing hobby of beekeeping still to come. First up, the fishing report.
This is Tom with your fishing report from the Northeast. Our spring pattern is running a week or 2 behind a normal year, so keep that in mind as you head out to do a little fishing. This delay is showing up big with the muskie fishing out on Cave Run Lake. The fish are still pretty scattered out, so you'll be doing a lot of different areas if you're casting or if you're trolling, covering a lot of water. Same rule applies on the streams as it does on the lakes. Keep moving, the fish are there, just scattered out a little bit. Trout have been stocked in almost all of our local trout streams already this month. This includes East Fork Indian, Swift Camp, Middle Fork Red, North Fork Triplet, and Main Stem Triplet. Swift Camp Creek is still under the delayed harvest regulations until the end of the month. That should do it for us in the Northeast. Wherever you go, good luck and stay safe.
This is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. Crappie fishing reports continue to be good at area lakes. At Dewey Lake, these fish are running 10 to 15 inches. At Paintsville Lake, better crappie fishing has been in the upper Little Payne Open Fork Arms. Yatesville, Buckhorn, Carr Creek, and Martinsport are not up to summer pool yet, but still having improved crappie action. Look for any shallow brush or structure in the current water level. Recent fishing has been very good for hybrid striped bass at Fish Trap Lake. Also, white bass are in the spring spawning run now. Dewey and Buckhorn Lake are having runs of these fish up into the river. First trout stockings at area tailwaters this year will occur from the 24th to the 30th. Streams and other small lakes can be checked for date stock on the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife website.
Hi, this is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Barren River Lake is still filling. However, bass action has been very very good with shallow crankbaits, lipless cranks, swim baits, spinner baits up on the flats and in coves. Crappie have been good around brush in 5 to 8 foot of water with tubes and minnows. Green River Lake, the upper sections of the lake are slightly stained with the lake near summer pool. Muskie have been good on lipless crankbaits, spinner baits, and swim baits. Crappie action has been good near brush in 5 to 10 foot of water with tubes, minnows, and road runners. For some good small lake crappie action, check out Shanty Hollow Lake in Warren County, West Fork Drakes near Franklin in Simpson County, and Marion County Lake. Locks and dams of the Green and Barren Rivers have been producing some good mixed bags of sauger, walleye, white bass, and bass, and also some good muskie action. As always, good luck and good fishing, and be sure you wear your life jacket.
In high school, I got my license and my first license plate, a nature plate. Now that I'm in college, it's still my choice, because year by year, these plates save more and more. More rich forests, more clean flowing streams, more of what we all want to hold on to for our future. If it's the wildcat, cardinal, or the butterfly plate, next time you renew, do like me. Say nature's finest and pick the plate that keeps our bluegrass green.
It's time to register for Kentucky's elk hunts. This is Tim Farmer. The Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website is Elk Central and the only place to enter this year's draw. Elk hunting in Old Kentucky. Take it from me, there's nothing like it. 1,000 names will be drawn, and with the Pick 2 option, you gotta like your odds. The deadline is midnight, April 30th. The Kentucky Elk Draw. Enter at fw.ky.gov. Again, fw.ky.gov.
You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We've been talking to Coleman Gilbert about the fun hobby of beekeeping. And joining us on the phone from his office in Lexington is Casey Schrader, who is with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Those are 4 words you may know more quickly as NRCS. A pollinator specialist also who has been on our show. Gentlemen, the subject of bees. I have heard a lot about bees are not native. I've heard their populations are dwindling. I've heard a lot of things. What is the truth about bees and how we have come to depend on them?
The European honeybee is not native to North America. It was brought here many years ago, and it's primarily our principal pollinator, but there's been some problems with the honeybee. It's got a couple parasitic diseases that are affecting people's ability to keep it. There's a strange disease right now that researchers aren't sure what's causing. It's called colony collapse disorder. This is where the whole hive just literally dies for no reason very suddenly, and they're still trying to figure out what's causing that. So the European honeybee is really in some trouble right now.
Coleman, in addition to bees, one reason you got into this was your absolute love of flowers. And I have seen your property. Everywhere you look, there's another patch of a native plant growing here, growing there. And collectively, you may not recognize this, but that is wildlife habitat. And pollinator habitat is what you have in your backyard. And Casey, that is one of your specialties in life, talking about pollinator habitat. What other wildlife benefits?
You know, the same habitat that we create for pollinators, that and that habitat, kind of a visual picture of that would be grasses, a few grasses, but mostly wildflowers, forbs, some of the things that we typically think of as weeds even, like ragweed or goldenrod, or those types of wildflowers that grow up, are also very important for other species like quail or rabbits that feed incidentally or use those areas as cover, will go in and raise their young there. So if you think about an area that has all these weeds and forbs and grasses that are sparsely populated in areas, and in some areas they're very thick, those provide protection. And if you're a little bobwhite quail that's newly hatched and 3 inches high, what are you going to eat? You're going to eat the pollinators that are actually in those areas. So it's all dependent upon the habitat that you provide and those areas that can provide those types of settings for those other creatures.
Coleman, let me just ask you the question. Have you seen an increase in the number of wild critters visiting your area, if that be rabbits or songbirds? Have you seen an increase since you have been doing this versus when you didn't?
Definitely tell there's an increase in the number of wildflowers that are on the property. And I've got 3.5 acres, and I kind of go back to a term that Casey said a while ago, and farm ugly, and that 2 acres of that is farm ugly. The rest of it is wildflowers and annuals, perennials, whatever.
You've got more than just your typical backyard, right?
Right. It's been certified as a wildlife habitat by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife in the backyard habitat program.
A lot of people will say, oh, that's a scruffy area. And it just has to be cleared. It just has to be manicured. It has to be a golf course, almost. And while that may look pretty to you and me, and I want either one of you to chime in on this, why is that not pretty to wildlife? Or here's a better question. Why is a scruffy area or an overgrown area the Waldorf Astoria to a butterfly?
Well, in a lot of instances, it's protection. I know we have rabbits, we have deer, foxes, and they all have a field day there because it offers a lot of protection. I've got an area where I throw brush, and it's quite a big brush pile now, and it harbors all kinds of birds, and it's kind of like a bird hotel. You can walk by it, and birds fly out everywhere.
You've seen this, too, in the real world out there, right, Casey?
That's right. You know, it's kind of like most of us. If there's nothing to eat there, we're not going to go there. If we're out in the middle of a place where we feel like we're in danger, we're not going to stay there very long. And it's the same thing with these areas that you described that look like a golf course. Yeah, they're really pretty to drive by and say, look how nice and clean that is. But for a wild critter out there, those areas don't provide anything that they need to live.
That's an opportunity to educate. Let's say you have a backyard gathering, and people are saying to themselves, what's he got going on over there? Couldn't he clear that out? Is that brush pile really, that's ugly.
Yeah.
Do you ever have that opportunity?
Oh, yeah.
To say, well, no, maybe it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, that's the neighbor across the road is into farming big time, and the brush pile that I've got, he's said, I wish you'd clear that out. It's kind of an eyesore because he sets up a little bit higher than I do. And I told him, I said, that's, I've got rabbits that run out of there. I've got birds that live in there, and the occasional snake or two that'll run in, and that's habitat.
Do you ever have that problem, Casey, where you have to say, when we're done creating this pollinator habitat, it ain't going to be pretty?
Yes, I do that all the time. I frequently work with landowners in the past that have really, you work all that time to get these plants established and to educate them, and then come out in a year or two and they've got the weed eater out, and so, well, it got grown up and I had to take it back down a little bit. That's quite frustrating, and I think that's just an educational process that needs to happen, and it's great that we have shows like this that can get that word out there that you don't need to mow or disc from field edge to field edge. There's all these little areas that you can keep, preserve those for wildlife. A little mini wildlife preserve, if you will.
Casey, I appreciate your help.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
You bet.
Bye.
So Coleman makes a good point that wildlife depends on habitat, and the plant life on someone's property is habitat, know it or not. People fancy themselves as flower gardeners, and my mother was one of these. I remember a long time ago, she would plant the devil out of marigolds. It'll grow a season, it dies, it won't come back the next. Differentiate for me some of the plants you may just pick up at your local big box store versus planting flowers as you do that are native plants.
The ones you buy at the big box stores can be perennials or annuals. I generally purchase my perennials to add a lot of color, a lot of pollen, and other sources of the native plants either aren't in bloom or have already bloomed.
Native plants. These are the plants that have been a part of the Kentucky landscape since the dawn of time. Wild animals that live here have come to depend on for food, for shelter. What are some of your favorite?
Probably the most favorite would be the Joe Pye weed. Bees really take to this plant. You can walk by a bloom on a Joe Pye weed, and it's just like an unbelievable buzzing sound that you can't help but take notice of it.
That does sound pretty. And what else do you grow?
A lot of asters. Asters for fall crop honey, they bloom late in the year. Probably the last things that bees get on in the fall season is an aster. There are native asters that were there when I moved there, and then there are asters that I buy and plant.
From what you're describing about your property, you have such a variety of native to Kentucky plants that there's always going to be something in bloom. True? True.
Generally, there is something blooming all through the year. The bee balm, the monarda, has really increased. You just have areas of, there again, a light lavender bloom on the monarda, and then the butterfly weed is a bright orange, and there are patches of it all over the property.
It seems like it would be a natural offshoot, if you're a flower gardener, to pick up the additional hobby of beekeeping, because the wildlife habitat is already there. The pollinator, the flower habitat is already there nearby. Is that the way it was for you?
It was a natural transition, because growing up when I was a kid, there were bees all over the place, and they were visiting the flowers. I had a lot of flowers that were on the property. I put a lot of flowers there, and the only thing lacking was the bees that were not coming around to visit the flowers.
Is raising native plants easy?
Native plants are, if you put them in the right place when you plant them, then they're pretty much self-sustaining. They take care of themselves pretty much. More drought tolerant for this area than some of the annuals or some of the store-bought plants, if you will.
That's what I was hoping to hear you say, that they take care of themselves. That's worth repeating. A native plant will take care of itself. And you can say, oh, God, I slave over this flower garden, when the truth is, you just have to sit back and let nature do its thing with a native plant.
And a lot of them you don't even have to plant. Nature puts them there for you, and you just enjoy them.
You said something a little bit ago off mic. One of the more educational things you will ever get into. Explain what you meant.
In the evening, when it was time for the bees to come back in from their foraging, I would sit down in front of the hives and just watch them come in, because usually they were either loaded down with nectar or they were loaded down with pollen, and it was just a fascinating sight to see. So many bees coming back into the hive that they were loaded down with yellow, purple, red, all different colors of pollen on their legs, where they'd gathered them that day. It's just fascinating.
I can see that. I can see it as clearly as you describe it. Talking about bees and beekeeping. A few more minutes on the subject when we come back. My name is Charlie Baglin, and this is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. Thanks for joining us. For the past hour, we have been talking about bees, beekeeping, honey production. It's sort of an interesting way that people choose to interact with nature. I, too, have a bee story. It's not the type of bee that we've been talking about. It's more in the form of, I got a B on a test instead of an A. Here's the story. This goes back a number of years ago. I was a student taking a biology class at Kentucky State University. I thought I'd done very well in the class. Feel like I have a knack for it. However, I got a B on a test. I thought I was going to get an A. The professor, Dr. David Gordon, and I sat down and I said, I want you to show me where I went awry. Justify to me, please, how I got a B instead of an A. And you know what? He did. He pointed it out. I said, okay, I'll drop the subject as long as you do me a favor. Well, he said, what's that? You got to remember, Dr. David Gordon is an entomologist. He has his Ph.D. in the field of bees. And he knows a lot about bugs in general. Bug's a bad word. Insects. And back in the day, we're going back 10, 12, 15 years ago, Kentucky Afield Radio was not an hour show like it is now. It was a 5-minute radio show, more like a radio report. And I asked him, I said, now I want you to sit down with me and my tape recorder and microphone and tell me what you know about all the bugs of summer. Butterflies, moths, bees, wasps, lightning bugs, so that I can make a series out of it. And he said, okay, I can do that. So I gathered together with him in his front yard, in lawn chairs, and we put together what has become an excellent series on insects of summer. And it's worth noting that I've come to respect and appreciate Dr. Gordon quite a bit, and more than I suspect other students would have. And to this day, I still consider him a friend. Now, teachers are great people. I don't care if it's first grade or kindergarten or college. At the end of the day, they want to help you be a better person. So let's go back to an audio archive, Kentucky Afield Radio, and the subject of bees. All the right buzzwords. Next on Kentucky Afield Radio. There is no mistaking that sound. Bees. Backyards and bee stings seem to go together. One reason is flowering clover growing in our yard. It attracts both bees and bare feet, especially with kids at play. It's a sting operation waiting to happen. But bees aren't the vicious creatures that we've grown up believing them to be.
Bumblebees are not aggressive, they're defensive. That's what they're doing, is they're defending themselves. But in general, they are very docile. Most bees are.
We continue our look at the bugs of summer this week with insect expert Dr. David Gordon. Bees aren't out to get us, he says, but when provoked, they're quick to tell us to buzz off.
If you're out rummaging around in the woodpile and there's a bumblebee nest in there, then they're likely to come out and defend their nest.
The bumblebee and the honeybee are just two of the hundreds of kinds of bees which live in Kentucky. If you see a bumblebee in your yard, that means your house is within foraging distance or about a quarter mile of a bumblebee nest. Depending on the time of the spring or summer you check, that nest could contain as few as 1 bee or up to 100.
Each individual will specialize on a particular kind of flower, like we're seeing this one here on clover. Bees are the most effective pollinators because they regularly visit and they go expressly to collect pollen.
In Kentucky and worldwide, bees play an exacting role in wildlife ecology.
When you look at the 20,000 species of bees, some of them are very specialized. Their emergence and their whole flight period is timed to match a specific kind of flower. So the seeds that the birds need, the berries that the animals need, are all dependent on bees particularly. So they're important not only for the reproduction of the plants, but also to produce food for the wildlife.
Many bees pose no threat at all, such as sweat bees and orchard bees. On the other hand, there's the Africanized honeybee, also known as the killer bee. This is a honeybee of the South American tropics. Should someone or something stray a little too close to the bee's territory, they can attack, and the result is often serious injury or death. While killer bees have expanded their range northward into Texas and the desert southwest, entomologists say that winters here are too cold for the bee to survive. Meanwhile, honeybees at home provide one sweet benefit: honey. One misconception is the fear of a swarm of bees.
About half the bees in the colony will go with the old queen and they fly away, and that's what's called a swarm. And when they're in that mode, you can pick them up. They won't attack you. They're very docile. It's hard to get stung when they're in the swarming mode because they don't have an established colony and they're not going to defend it.
And being busy as a bee doesn't exactly mean a beehive of activity.
They are very productive, but people that have followed individual bees and what they do during the day, they do spend a lot more time doing nothing than you've been led to believe.
We should have a healthy respect for bees. And to avoid contact, Dave recommends when in the lawn, leave the sneakers on. Watch for bees flying into or out of cracks in an outside wall, or when moving items that have been sitting still for a while, such as pieces of firewood. That's the perfect place for a bee's nest. For the most part, the fear of bees, or apophobia, isn't warranted. Remember, the bee you see today will only be alive about 3 more weeks anyway. No one's going to argue with giving a bee a little space, but we can be a little tough on a bug whose primary duty is to create wildflowers or food for people and wildlife. it makes you wonder just what all the buzz is about. Kentucky Afield Radio is a broadcast service of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, your partner in the great outdoors. I don't say it enough, but thanks to our affiliate stations around Kentucky for helping us reach more and more people with what they love about Kentucky. Fishing, wildlife, boating, getting out there and loving every minute of it. If you haven't done it yet, sign up for the Kentucky Afield newsletter. Just go to kyafield.com. It's down toward the bottom on the right-hand side. You'll see an icon there that says newsletter. You click that. All we need from you there is your email address. We'll do it again next week with a complete hour with Kentucky Afield TV host Tim Farmer. He'll be in to talk turkey with us. Plus, we'll go behind the scenes of Tim and his personal life. It's what they call in the business riveting conversation. Meanwhile, I'm Charlie Baglin. Join us again in a week. We will go inside outdoors again right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.